It is Montreal now. Tom Whelan sitting in for Aaron Rand this afternoon at CJAD 800. And we're joined now by Amanda Lang. She is a CTV News chief financial correspondent. And Amanda, there certainly are a number of financial issues we can discuss this afternoon.
There definitely is a lot going on, I would say, Tom.
Yeah.
And, interesting that we get jobs data today that's disappointing because it, separate from everything else that's going on, would point to a weakening economy and some red flags in terms of how well businesses are holding up, how well consumers are holding up. And then, of course, you got to overlay it with all of this geopolitical crisis that could actually be really bad for the economy. So already weak and maybe heading into trouble.
So do we think that what's going on overseas in the Middle East has any impact, or is that's too recent to have had the impact that StatsCan reported today?
Yeah, we're looking at February data, so it wouldn't really show up yet. And I always say when we talk about the labor force survey, it's in some ways it's an imperfect survey because there's a lot of human error and self-reporting that goes on, and so we get revisions to these numbers. Nevertheless, it is the worst showing we've seen in about 4 years. So it's definitely a weak read, and it'd be hard to imagine seeing it reverse much. If we factor in inflation that could be coming from what's happening in Iran, then you can expect this kind of data to get even worse.
And it seems here at home, anyway, that the people who have been hit hardest by job losses are young people and specifically young men.
Yeah, that youth category did tick up again. So youth unemployment is now above 14% again. That's painful. One thing that I did note, Tom, which is worth noting, is that what they call core-aged men, so men who are in their kind of core working years, it actually has pretty decent showing. Jobs that are holding firm there, and their unemployment rate is much lower. It's something like, I think it's 5.7%. So it's way below the headline level, which is good because if you think about kind of youth often have more flexibility. There's maybe a lot of reasons why young people work or don't work, and it's often part-time work because they might also be studying. So that core group is doing pretty well. Some bad news for Quebec, which is the data is for all of Canada, but only 4 provinces saw big job losses, and Quebec was one of them. Some provinces, including Ontario, kind of held their ground in the month. So some particular weakness showing up in pockets of the country.
Could that have anything to do with tariffs? I mean, Quebec is so heavily into the aluminum sector and that sort of thing. So
100% related to tariffs. In fact, I shouldn't say 100%, but absolutely, especially anything on the manufacturing side. We're starting to see it's gone on long enough. Businesses have held on as much as they can. Government supports are in place, but we've just seen this from businesses that have received support and they're still struggling because those tariffs are painful. And we're really not out of the woods. We got kind of a quasi victory in some ways from the U.S. Supreme Court on some forms of tariffs, but not the ones that have been applied in Canada. And we know we're still very much kind of in the sights of the U.S. In terms of what might come down the road on our negotiations with on the new CUSMA. So it's all pretty painful. There are some supports in place for business. I guess the question we have to ask, especially if we go into a prolonged conflict in the Middle East, is there enough support in place, and will the government have to do more?
Now, speaking of tariffs, we heard from U.S. President Donald Trump that he unveiled a new list of countries that he says are being investigated for potentially having policies or practices that he calls unreasonable or discriminatory, and that they burden or restrict the U.S. What can you tell us about that?
So we knew that the White House would try to come to some other form of tariffs because they're the tariffs that were struck down by their own Supreme Court are now being reversed, and a lot of businesses are working to get refunds on the money that's been paid. Trump had said right away, we'll find another way. So he's looking for other ways. The good news, I think, if we can cling to it, it doesn't help us in the short term. But the good news is, first of all, a lot of the time this stuff happens separate from the Canadian story because we do have protections in place in our current trade agreement. We're still protected. Most of what we trade is still 90+ tariff-free, 90%. So that's the good news. And also, he's targeting other countries in this kind of round he's trying to replace the ones that he's lost. What it does do, though, is create new uncertainty, the sense that this is a White House that will keep trying to do new and unpleasant things, and that makes it really hard for businesses to feel confident. And we really need businesses to be confident in order to spend.
No kidding. And, we've been added to that list of countries that he's going to be, quote unquote, investigating. But by what you just said, he can investigate all he likes, apparently, but it won't really change very much as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, there are some things. We know that we've had longstanding disputes, for instance, on softwood lumber, like multi-decade disputes, and Canada can win at the World Trade Organization. It can win at different sort of arbitration bodies, and we still end up paying a price because the U.S. doesn't agree. This administration has been very clear that it has our supply management system in its sights. And again, very Quebec-heavy story here. It does want to go after, he specifically mentioned dairy. And the question is, of course, we've had successive governments swearing that they will protect this system and it's not on the table. But if he goes after it, that may change kind of the stakes and what we need to do to negotiate. It may force us to revisit how we handle it, at least in terms of how we talk about it to the U.S.
Now, Amanda, just before we go, I want to turn our attention for a second to oil, and more specifically oil in the Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. Apparently, the U.S. has issued a 30-day license for countries to buy Russian oil and petroleum products. Now, how can the U.S. issue licenses to buy Russian oil?
So there were sanctions that were put in place after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right. This is sort of along the same lines as the IEA saying they'll release from strategic reserves. It's good in theory. It might settle down the actual trading market in oil. In practice, if you get your oil from one source, switching to another is not exactly an overnight affair. So it might be a relief to some to be able to source from a new place. Certainly, China might see some real relief. Taiwan gets a lot of its natural gas, LNG, through the Strait of Hormuz. That's important to keep its factories running. It turns out an awful lot of chips we need. But this might actually be more of a reassurance, just like that IEA release, than it will be a practical change. Really the price of oil will settle down when the Strait of Hormuz is open, when the conflict is over.
Right. So for the time being, it might be a slight Band-Aid approach to the situation at this point.
People are trying to be as reassuring as possible. This is another one, but the way that he could reassure the world is to suggest that this conflict won't go on for months and months. We're getting new estimates every day from economists saying if it goes on for months and months, we're in for triple-digit oil and real renewed inflation and possibly a recession. So there's a scary specter on that front, and everybody's sort of hoping that the duration of this is short enough not to cause maximum damage.
Let's keep our fingers crossed on this Friday the 13th. Amanda, thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon. I really appreciate your insight and your expertise.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Introducing Bryan Adams Radio on iHeartRadio. Hosted by Bryan Adams himself.
Join me for an insider look on a wild ride through 40 years of global rock and roll.
Bryan Adams Radio. Now available on the free iHeartRadio app. Or ask your smart speaker to play Bryan Adams Radio on iHeartRadio.
Who's ready to rock?
Everywhere I go, kids wanna rock.